Hello guys, welcome back to another video about the Crimean War. Today we are going to talk about the Crimean War that happened between 1853 and 1856. This war was so important because it was the biggest war between Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. This war showed the improvements in technology and since the Napoleonic Wars. So let's get into it. As of 1853, the tensions between the Ottoman and the Russian Empire were uneasy at best. For hundreds of years, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire have been fighting around the Black Sea. The tension would spark another war, one lot deadlier than the last. There's more to the story of the start of the war than just historic rivalry. It mainly has to do with religion. During the first half of the 1800s, Russia was a protector of Christians, most importantly Orthodox Christians, in the Ottoman Empire. But as of 1852, Napoleon III, not the famous one, but his nephews, became the protector of all Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And that was okay with the Ottomans, but who wasn't happy about that idea was the Russians. So the Russians did the most Russian thing, expand. And so they occupied a place called the Danubian Principalities, which is where modern day Romania is today. The Russians occupied the Danubian Principalities on July of 1853. It is worth mentioning that the Russians did not declare war when occupying the principalities. They just did expansion. But the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid I declared war on the Russian Empire on October 5th, 1853. The declaration of war came with a Turkish offensive, which had moderate success for the Turkish. On November 30th, 1853, a Russian fleet saw an Ottoman squadron taking harbor near the city of Sinop. This would be no ordinary naval battle. The Russian commander had a trick up his sleeve. His ships were equipped with the highly explosive and dangerous shells. This was the first time explosive shells have ever been used in warfare. And the Russians found 11 ships at the Sinop. At the end of the day, all the ships were destroyed. It didn't matter if they surrendered to the Russians. The commander ordered to kill them anyways. This battle destroyed the Turkish navy in the Black Sea. After Sinop, the British and the French brought their navies in the Black Sea to escort Ottoman transports on January 5th of 1854. In March of 1854, the French and British sent an ultimatum to the Russian Empire, demanding that the Russian Empire should pull out their games in the Ottoman Empire, or else the British and French would declare war on the Russian Empire. The reasons for sending the ultimatum to Russia is that since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the great powers of Europe have been trying to maintain a balance in power in Europe. So the British and the French saw the Russian invasion of the Ottoman Empire a threat to the balance of power. They did not think they would stop at the Danubian principalities. They thought the Russians' real target was Constantinople, a much more valuable prize. And the reason for French declaring war, well, the biggest in their eyes, is they were trying to regain prestige since the Napoleonic Wars, where they saw a complete and utter loss. The Tsar Nichlos I of Russia did not comply with these demands, so on March 28, 1854, the British and French declared war on the Russian Empire. Then shortly after, on July 26, 1854, the Russians withdrew from the Danubian principalities. Why? Well, mostly because of the Austrian Empire threatened to join the war on the Turkish side if they did not withdraw. So, with little to no choice, the Russians withdrew quickly. Follow, Following the evacuations, the Austrians moved into the Danubian principalities as a neutral peacekeeping force. In September of 1854, the Allies landed on the peninsula of Crimea. They did not land on a port, however. This made it a lot harder to get supplies to Crimea and reinforce the troops. The landing was on the west coast of Crimea. The main reason why they landed on the Crimean Peninsula is that they were looking to take the vital port of Sevastopol, which was just south of where they landed. The Crimean War gets its name because the major fighting took place in Crimea. The landing was rather slow, though. It took close to a week. The reason why it took this long is because, again, they did not land at a port. There's no huge engagement by the Russians to dispute the landings of the Crimea. After the Allies got situated, all their forces marched off south to take Sevastopol, but the Allied march was stopped shortly after they were encountered by immense resistance at the Alma River. On September 20th, 1854, the Russians were dug in, and they lost 6,000 at the Battle of Alma, while the Allies only took 3,300 losses. The main reasons why the defending Russians took so much more losses than the attacking Allies is that because they were poorly equipped. They were still using 40-year-old Napoleonic rifle, and the Allies were using brand new muskets. Since the Allies were much better equipped, they continued marching south. Soon they were able to encircle the entire city of Sevastopol, beginning the siege of Sevastopol on October 17th, 1854. One problem with the British military is that their officers were not the most professionals. The officers were given their position by status instead of by merits. The troops' conditions were terrible. They were starving in the trenches, and many soldiers have succumbed to disease. More troops died from disease than gunfire during the Crimean War. In the Crimean siege of Sevastopol, it was trench warfare. The movement was slow, and the front line was heavy losses. This trench warfare added to the horrible effect of disease on the troops of the British. Another important event that happened in 1855 was the death of Tsar Nichlos I. On March 2nd, 1855, the Tsar of Russia died of pneumonia at the age of 58. This was the most likely be a good thing for Russia because he was an incompetent ruler, and he was replaced by the much more competent Alexander II. Alexander was a former reformer and sought to modernize the Russian state. He saw the state at the time to be backwards and corrupt. It was slow moving on the Crimean Peninsula during the siege of Sevastopol, but the siege was coming to an end, and this siege would last 11 months. But finally, the Allied forces were gaining ground, and on September 11th, 1865, after the vital storming of the Mokov Bastion, the Russians began sinking ships and evacuating and blowing up supplies. They did this so the Allies could get their hands on no more ships or supplies, and after almost a year, the siege was over. This made it clear to Russia that the war was lost, but they did not formally admit that until the Austrians threatened to join the Allies. Then the Russians accepted preliminary peace negotiations. On February 1st, 1866, they accepted these negotiations, and finally, they first met in the Congress of Paris on February 24th, 1866. They would continue meeting until March 30th, resulting in one of the many treaties of Paris. The Treaty of Paris said that all occupied lands would be given back to their original owner. But there was one exception to this rule. The exception was that Russia had to give the Ottoman Empire Bessarabia, which was a very important province since Bessarabia is where the Danube River is. And then another thing the treaty stated is that the Danube became international waters, and since the war was fought over to protect the Ottoman Empire, the signatories guaranteed the independence and territorial integrity of the Turks. The Black Sea was demilitarized to everyone. That greatly hurted the Sevastopol port because if there's no point in having a military port on a place where you can't have military ships. This treaty was supposed to relieve tensions between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, but it did no such thing because within 30 years they were back at war, and it was also supposed to maintain the balance of power within Europe, but the balance of power would be scrapped in less than 20 years when Germany unified because the reason why it was scrapped is because Germany was more powerful than everyone else, and there's no point in having a balance of power when one person is more powerful. At the end of the war, there were around 1 million civilians and soldiers dead for a treaty that didn't work. And this war was the first look into modern warfare. The Crimean War would give a hint at what the First World War would be like. One thing that a lot of soldiers took away from this is how utterly pointless this war was. And there's a reason. If they wanted the next war, they would want it to be for a reason. Hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.